Hello and welcome to We Got Planning News for You. Thank you, as always, for joining us. As you know by now, if you're regular viewers, in lieu of registration fee, we encourage our viewers to make a donation to charity, either to a charity of your choice or one of our three favourite charities, Shelter for the Housing Crisis, the GoFundMe Ukraine page for the war in Ukraine, or Brian May's Save Me Trust. Now, on the subject of the Save Me Trust, can I draw your attention to a very new, awesome band in America called Tempt, who covered We Will Rock You, Brian May's famous song, and I've got a big single out covering that tomorrow, and by hook or by crook, they've managed to arrange to donate all their proceeds from that to Brian's Save Me Trust. So I suggest you download that. A very good video indeed. We are delighted to welcome for a record-breaking third time on the show, the Chief Planner, Joanna Averley. I think Chris's advert for our show said you've been Chief Planner since the year 2000. I think probably for your sake, it's a good thing that isn't the case as opposed to since 2020, Joanna. But we're obviously really looking forward to hearing from you, particularly about government's perspective on the various recent actual and proposed changes to planning policy that are well publicised. But in the meantime, prior to that, we've got 4 cases to deal with. Prior to that, though, we need to introduce the panel. I notice Paul isn't with us just yet, but Chris, perhaps we'll start with you today because you seem to be in a different than usual location. So how are you?
Charlie, and hello, Joanna. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm in France. I'll tell you where I am. Actually, here's a map. We're all geographers, aren't we? So you can see that. That is Mont Blanc down there. And I'm here, just there in Chamonix. And I'm here with JCB and some others. And we're here for a little light skiing for the weekend. And I'm just glad the Wi-Fi is working. I've been worrying about it all day.
Of course, it's the easy option to go down a mountain, but some of us actually climbed Mont Blanc going up it. Much harder. Mary, you're in 20% Vault.
You guys, you're so competitive, right to the slopes. Amazing. I'm sitting here in the town legal offices drinking my lovely Yorkshire tea out of my town mug, and I'm very well and looking forward to the show and the interview with Joanna. Thank you.
Excellent. Paul is in a car, of course. Which motorway are you on today, Paul?
I'm currently somewhere between Warrington and Tarporley, in the corner of a service area, long away from the petrol pumps. And I didn't want to disappoint my audience. What can I say, Charlie?
And they couldn't even give you a room by the hour. That is your usual. Your want. Sasha, lovely to see you too, as always.
Lovely to see you, Charlie. I'm very tempted to phone the said service station and warn them there's a suspicious man in the corner that needs investigation. I'm in the home of the league leaders. I'm in London, and very happy.
Paul, if it wasn't for the fact that I assume there's boxes behind you, I must say you look like you're on a pizza delivery mission. The man from
branching out.
I must say, Domino's have really smartened up their app these days. You get away with the man with the minutes to go over the tie.
I've been listening half an hour, mate. Sorry.
Last, but of course not least, Joanna, are you calling from the department this evening, or where?
Yeah, I'm in Whitehall, and you get a reflection of the office. Yeah. The lights are going to go on and off. I nearly had to start waving there. But if you know your Whitehall, and the windows behind me, it's Department for Transport, and the reflection is DCLG, DLUHC, sorry. So yes, in the middle of Whitehall, literally.
Sort of probably something allegorical about DLUHC and DFT reflecting each other or something.
I know. There are occasionally you're on calls and you sort of think, could walk across the road, or occasionally down the corridor to DEFRA.
And I assume if you're still at work, you're on the soft stuff. Are you drinking water or coffee?
Yeah, drinking water. I was going to put you all on the spot because I chickened out of suggesting a theme, but then I thought of one, and only two of you actually have any prior warning. So can I have my moment to put you on the spot before you? What
is your theme that you chose?
My theme is reunion, and I'll tell you why. So you can quickly think about what you might say about that. So I think what I'm really reflecting on at the moment is a lot of people across the industry are it's tough out there, isn't it? There's lots of pressures on all of us. And we're sometimes short of resources, and sometimes we're back at the office, sometimes we're not. And I've got the real pleasure tonight of sort of celebrating, going back to meet the people I first started working with in 1991, who worked for Llewellyn Davis when I was a year out student, and then I went back when I graduated. And what a fantastic bunch they were. They were generous with their expertise. They were generous with their time. We had fantastic work to do with the Department of Environment and LPAC and others at the time, and you kind of got that fabulous grounding. But the reunion of just meeting colleagues from the industry face to face, having those conversations, having those sort of side chats, which is where you actually problem solve, and just celebrating a fantastic industry, multidisciplinary, passionate, and hardworking, and just trying to do good things.
I refuse to be outdone by your theme, even though you gave it 2 minutes ago. I've got a Euros cap on where I was reunited for the first time with Sasha and Charlie whilst we've been doing this show. So 2 minutes notice and I still delivered.
Now, let's go straight into the case reports. Obviously, Joanna, I imagine that I normally obviously say to the guests, and then any do your free comments. I imagine on this occasion, you'll stay firmly on mute. You're welcome to turn your camera off if you prefer. We look forward to your interview led by Chris later on. But first up, Mary's going to take us to the Court of Appeal.
Indeed, I am. And this is all about a decision made on the 13th of January 2021 when the council refused planning permission for a housing development. But a local resident, Mr. Blacker, supported the development, which was for housing on a partly PDL and partly greenfield site. There you are. You can see the citation. You can see the barristers involved. It was a cornerstone affair. And the essence of this is that the planning officer, had recommended refusal, mainly because the housing development would have resulted in the loss of an employment site. Critically, the council's constitution provided a planning code which stipulated that where members were minded to grant a permission contrary to an officer recommendation to refuse, the determination of the application must be deferred to the next meeting for consideration of the appropriate conditions and the reasons for the decision, but also for consideration of the implications of the decision, which needed to be reported back to members. And in addition, the code required that only those members present at the first meeting could vote in relation to the identified reasons for refusal. So at the first meeting, which was conducted via Zoom and was said to be conducted in a quite incoherent manner, members voted by 8-6 that they were in fact minded to grant the permission. And so, in accordance with the planning code, the minutes recorded that the matter be deferred in accordance with the Constitution. At the second meeting, there was a report which set out proposed conditions, but members were reminded that no formal decision had been made and that all options at that stage remained open. In the event, the application was refused 10-1 with 2 abstentions. Several members changed their minds and explained why in the debate. So, Mr. Blacker's challenge in the court below and repeated in the Court of Appeal was that the first decision invoked the principle of consistency, and that there was no consistency in the second decision, which was obviously completely different to the first. But the judge found below that the principle of consistency wasn't invoked, and it was really all about identifying what that first decision was. Was it an in-principle decision to grant, or was it not? And the court found that it wasn't an in-principle decision, and therefore the principle consistency wasn't invoked. And in the Court of Appeal, they agreed, but they also went on to say that even if the principle of consistency had been invoked, then the council had acted in accordance with that principle, because those who had changed their minds identified the fact that they were changing their minds and identified. So there we go. That's the case of Black. Thank you very much.
Court case and some important lessons there. Now, the Secretary of State has issued a well-known minded to grant letter in relation to prison in Lancashire. So it's over to our representative from Domino's. Paul, go to jail, do not pass go, do not collect £200.
Eat pizza.
The hilarious part actually is this is the remnants of a recording studio. My middle son, who does the music for the show, has just moved and he's kitting out his basement. He asked me to call in and collect this on the way back from my inquiry. I am literally rammed with the recording studio gup. So that's what a father does. But anyway, Leyland Prison. So this is a decision from the Parliamentary Undersecretary of State for Local Government and Building Safety, Lee Rowley, on behalf of the Secretary of State. It's a minded to grant decision, or rather non-decision, in respect of a hybrid proposal for a prison of about 75,000 square metres, close to HMP Garth and HMP Wymot in Leyland. That's mostly greenfield, all greenbelt, and a little bit of PDL. There was an application to Chorley Borough Council in August of 2021, refused in December 2021, appealed, and then there was a 7-day inquiry in July 2022. The local authority was represented by Piers Riley-Smith. Jenny Wigley represented the government promoting, and there was a group of barristers who appeared on a pro bono basis, led by Joe Cannon, to oppose it as part of a local action group. So it's an interesting case for that aspect as well, that advocates instructed pro bono counsel to act on behalf of a local residents group. But a whole series of issues in relation to it. Obviously, whether there was very special circumstances, whether need was demonstrated, whether alternative sites were demonstrated, and whether it was acceptable in highway terms. The Secretary of State, the inspector concluded that there were problems in relation to a number of different aspects. He concluded that that the highway hadn't been proven in relation to the quantification of works which might resolve the problems and therefore avoid giving rise to severe highway effects, but also concluded the alternative sites appraisal wasn't up to much. Also concluded there would be significant effects on the greenbelt and also on character and appearance. And ultimately, the inspector, Tom Gilbert-Waldridge, recommended that the application be refused. It's then gone onto the desk of the Secretary of State, who's agreed with everything that the inspector said, apart from this issue of highways. And the Secretary of State or rather the Undersecretary of State, has said, well, go back and try again, because I would be minded to conclude that very special circumstances has been demonstrated if you can demonstrate that the highway works can be quantified and can demonstrably get over the problems which have been demonstrated. I've got to say, if this wasn't HM government that was promoting a prison, it's very difficult to see that the Secretary of State would have sent it back to the applicant as a private individual or private developer to say, well, you've not really proved your case, but go and have another go, and then I'll be minded to grant. It's a very odd decision. It's not unique. There have been other instances where there's been minded to grants, usually in situations where there's been defects with the 106. But this is certainly one that's unique in my experience, where it's a greenbelt case where VSC has been essentially minded to be found, and yet the Secretary of State says there's a crucial element that there's more evidence that's needed upon. It's an oddity for a whole host of reasons. Don't think there's any real principles, but procedurally it's all over the place. But an interesting case in any event, and it's close to home.
Thanks, Paul. Be interested to see how that one plays out. Well, I'm next. I'm going to tell you about a decision in West Oxfordshire District Council's area. It's an appeal by Aylescove Strategic Land against a refusal by West Oxfordshire District Council of planning permission for up to 120 dwellings on a greenfield site on the edge of a village which Chris and our flyer quite rightly called a charmingly called village called Ducklington, which to my mind connotes images of village greens and ducks swimming around a pond. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the rather cute image it conjures up. Anyway, based upon the reasons for refusal, the main issues were identified by the inspector as firstly the effect of the scheme on the character and appearance of the area, in terms of scale, alleged coalescence and loss of green space. And secondly, effect of the scheme on the Duckington Conservation Area, which the site was outside but near to. Now, the Inspector John Longmer allowed the appeal, and in relation to character and appearance, he started by noting that the site and its surroundings were not a designated landscape or valued landscape. And he went on to note that it was adjacent to and influenced by, in landscape, character and visual terms, residential properties on one side, as well as an electricity substation. And there were several pylons and electricity wires leading to and from the substation, which prominently, in his words, traversed the site. He found that there would be a degree of coalescence between Duckington and the nearby village of Witney as a result of the development, but he didn't think that coalescence was particularly significant because it would only be on one side of the road. The other side of the road already had extensive development all along it, so there already was a degree of coalescence. He felt that the loss of openness from the development wouldn't be significant, bearing in mind the urban influences on the site already in terms of the pylons, etc., and adjacent influences. And interestingly, in terms of the visual impact of the development, he thought the visual impact would be neutral. I'll come back to that later. He said the views of the appeal site would change from an area of open land dominated by pylons to residential buildings, but with some open space, landscaping, and loss of pylons. He noted in particular the scheme was low density with 42% open space, and that was a key factor in the inspector concluding that the scheme was acceptable, not just in terms of its L&V impact, but also in terms of its perceived scale. He then went on to consider the second identified main issue, this effect on the significance of the conservation area. I would say, I'm not just saying this in case the inspector's listening, don't know whether he is or isn't, but the path decision here is really impressive in terms of the structure the inspector used in considering the issue. So he started by considering under a subheading the main elements that contributed to the significance of the conservation area. The next subheading was the main elements which contribute to the conservation area, which were most relevant to the appeal scheme and site. Then he went on to pose the question, does the appeal site contribute to those elements, those contributors to significance? And he concluded to a limited extent it did. And then finally he went on to consider the effect of the appeal scheme on the contribution that the site made to those particular aspects of the contributors to the conservation area significance. So I'd suggest that sequence is dare I say, an analytically impeccable sequence of headings by which to consider the effect of development on the setting of a designated heritage asset. You look at significance to the conservation area, what are the main contributors to significance, what are the relevant ones to the site, what's the site's performance in relation to those, and how will the development affect that contribution. So overall, he said, applying that methodology, for want of a better term, he considered that there would only be very limited harm, less than substantial harm to the conservation area, and not upper end less than substantial harm as the council has contended. And then in the paragraph 202 framework balance, he considered the public benefits, including the housing and affordable housing delivery benefits of the scheme, outweighed the limited less than substantial harm. And then turning to the tilted balance, he considered the adverse effects of granting permission wouldn't significantly demonstrably outweigh the benefits. So in terms of the key points of wide application, I'd say there are probably three. Firstly, where you're promoting a development or acting for the promoted development, consider an ample degree of open space, more than standard, in order to overcome potential concerns about the effect of development on character and scale. Secondly, not all greenfield development is negative in terms of visual impacts. Here, because of the existing detractors, the inspector thought the visual effects of the housing would be neutral. And thirdly, if you're writing a report or decision document in relation to the effect of a proposed development on the setting of a heritage asset, you could do far, far worse than to copy the sequence of headings in what I've described already as an analytically impeccable analysis of development on the setting of a conservation area in this case. So that's the first of two, in fact, West Oxfordshire appeals. The other one, Sasha, you're going to tell us about.
I am, Charlie, but I first of all got to just mention to Joanna, I'm very upset I didn't get my invite tonight because I also started work in 91. So I'm Joanna, it's never too late. Right. Can I then deal with this case? Yes, I'm dealing with a case, and Rob might put it up, but it's basically I'm also in West Oxfordshire in the delightful village of Freeland, which is in West Oxfordshire. This, as we can see, was an application and appeal for 160 extra care units in this village by Senior Living, and the decision is of last week, the 18th of January. Now, we've all been in this position. I think my reading, I wasn't there, I wasn't part of this appeal, but we've all done appeals where you just get a sense that the case on behalf of the appellant just hasn't grabbed the inspector in any real way. And I get this sense from this decision. I mean, there are various points I wanted to identify. The first is that the inspector just didn't like the scale of the proposal. Freeland is quite a small village. It was 28 or 29 out of the 41 settlements ranked in sustainability criteria in West Oxfordshire, and the proposal would effectively amount to a 13% increase in the residences and the population of Freeland. So the first point the inspector didn't like was the scale and nature of the increase in population, which he described as it couldn't sensibly be described as limited, which was obviously an aspiration of policy. The second point, which is noteworthy, is that there was a pretty significant HLS shortfall in West Oxfordshire. The council said 4.1. The inspector sided more favourably with the appellant, saying about 2.5. The third point, of course, consequently was tilted balances in play and not disengaged by Para 202, so that was passed. But fundamentally, I get a sense, going back to my point, the inspectors make some pretty damning comments about the scheme. The necessary scale and form of the buildings across the site would dominate and be wholly uncharacteristic of the local context. So we've all been there. I just don't think the inspector liked what was proposed. The other thing I just wanted to identify, two other noteworthy matters. Something that I really don't like, but did happen in this case from the LPA, was the identification for the first time in the proof of evidence that it was a valued landscape. The inspector endorsed that conclusion, but it's always slightly, I think it should be set out in the statement of case. If a valued landscape is going to be contended, that came forward for the first time in the proof of evidence. And the other point is the inspector gives quite a strong view on how to weigh evidence from third parties, the LPA and the appellants. And he notes here, which is quite interesting, that I've taken out the arguments in respect of the absence of comparative professional qualifications from certain witnesses and the impartiality of others. And then he says, where elements of the evidence were evidently speculative, including in respect to testimonies from residents or other inspired villages, error or unsubstantiated, either reduced or attributed no weight. However, I found the crux of the arguments and evidence being put both by the council and the Rule 6 to be capable of substantiating their respective standpoints on the principal issues at play. Reading between the lines, the inspector obviously is giving some pretty significant weight to the local residents' arguments, notwithstanding their absence of professional qualifications. So that are the important points, Charlie, from that appeal decision. Thank you.
Thanks, Sasha. Really interesting. It's a small miracle that you both managed to cover the right West Oxfordshire case. The wrong one. Trust me, the chances of that actually having played out is quite small. Now, Chris, over to you to introduce Joanna for a third time to our viewers and to start off the interview. And by the way, I should say before I hand over to you, encourage our guests, please do add any questions you'd like any of us to ask Joanna to the Q&A, and we'll do our best to pick a couple of those during the course of the evening.
Okay, thank you very much, Charlie. Well, Joanna, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us for this third time. Now, previously, we have covered your incredible career and your rise to your current position as Chief Planner. But looking at your CV, something caught my eye this time, and it is, although you were born in Kenya, which sounds very exotic, you grew up in your father's hometown of Leyland in Northern Ireland. And you did that during the Troubles in the 1970s and 80s, and in an area which is the so-called murder triangle, it says here, where sectarian violence was at its worst. And you have said that has taught you in experience to appreciate neutrality and much more besides, and the resilience of the community in Northern Ireland. Now, you have obviously faced challenging times, which leads me to my questions. The first question I want to ask you about is about the changes to the MPPF. There is a lot of discussion about this. You will have been and seen that. I don't want to get into any of the politics because that's not appropriate to ask you about as a civil servant. But what I do want to ask you about is what is the purpose of the changes, first of all, in terms of design? What are you seeking to achieve through those changes? Thanks,
Chris. The MPPF update is, which was sort of launched before Christmas, 22nd of December, is a really important document. So it sets out the sort of first phase of changes that we'll be bringing forward in an update to the MPPF in the spring. And it's the start of then the sort of fuller update of the MPPF that will come forward later on. And as colleagues on this call will know, we did quite a lot of work and launched a previous update to the MPPF in the summer of 2021, where we were absorbing or reflecting on the recommendations of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission. And part of that work was the publication of the National Model Design Code, the sort of daughter document to the National Design Guide, and basically providing a framework to have an updated menu of issues that cover all aspects of design and placemaking and beauty for planning applications and in policy making, and support local authorities preparing design codes which will become mandatory within the application of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act when it becomes an act. And the most recent updates on beauty actually present two quite interesting sort of ideas, which are sort of, I suppose, play through quite commonly as we look at, generally, as we all professionally look at planning applications and how to evaluate the quality that's on the table in front of us. I'm going to start with the second one, which is actually just visual material. It's not unusual, I think we'd all probably agree, that we might be looking at a planning application and it's not immediately apparent what is being sought for permission and what's being sought is what is being presented as a sort of an idea of what might be pursued as a development and the ultimate delivery of quality that you might expect, whether that's the architecture of the house, whether it's the treatment of the landscape and so on and so forth. And we're all getting used to using parameters plans, and sometimes you have things that are referred to as illustrative, and they're conditioned as illustrative, which I think is a fascinating idea as well. Can you condition something that's illustrative? And then obviously we're starting to look at design codes coming through. So one of the changes, and if colleagues haven't spotted it, I'm sure you probably have, we've issued a track changes version of the MPPF specifically for the changes that we'd be proposing to bring in subject to consultation this spring. And one of them talks about, having clear and accurate plans and drawings. And it really is talking to making sure that material is clear to everybody, the community, the decision makers, and so on and so forth. So as you go from, say, an outline application to reserve matters, all that you're clear at which stages what's being signed up to. The second element which is being implemented or proposed to be implemented in this first update is about clarifying where, for example, it's a small thing, but where you have a street that's got the ability to sort of allow houses and homes to adapt with mansards, for example, and where people have quite mixed experience as to whether that's something that local authorities are reluctant to consider, or whether some local authorities are actually quite pro and they have adopted design guides and they've thought it through and they actually intentionally promote the use of mansards and changing sort of some of the layout of houses to accommodate bigger families and better spaces for people. So that's quite a small change, but quite relevant in certain communities and neighbourhoods. And then the third element is about bringing, I suppose, the concept of beauty into the MPPF with a little few word changes. And I suppose I just remind everybody, when we talk about design quality, we can go back to Vitruvian principles of firmness, commodity, and delight, which is basically, does it function well? Is it built to last? And does it bring delight? Is it beautiful? Does it lift our spirits? Does it have that qualitative aspect, which is really about it standing the test of time? And to some extent, it's quite intentionally sort of talking about beauty as well as design quality and all those other aspects as outlined in the National Model Design Code into the MPPF in a few edits.
Okay, right, thank you. And I was keen that you did make a reference to mansard roofs because that had a few of us puzzled, but now we're a little wiser as to why that's there. Okay, now I want to move to what is undoubtedly generating the most level of interest, which is what is the purpose behind moving to voluntary housing targets?
Okay, so unsurprisingly, this is a topic of much interest, and just to sort of, I suppose, explain what the proposals are, and I suppose some of the nuance around the proposals. So local housing need has always been the starting point for local authorities to evaluate and apply those needs to their plan making. And then obviously it sort of plays through in terms of other ramifications when the presumption and so on then kicks in certain circumstances currently. What the government really considers to be a sort of current issue, and we all know this, and is we are very intentionally, and government are very intentionally about a plan-led system, and yet we only have 40% coverage of up-to-date plans. So there's a mismatch between us having a plan-led system where a community basically, and a council has a strategy for their place, which brings together spatial realities, environmental realities, housing need, environmental change, adaptation, all those things into a single strategy, which is about their place. So the changes that are being brought forward are, in a sense, saying to local authorities, if there are things that are disincentivizing you to plan because you feel that maybe, things are being imposed rather than you're making active decisions, then there's some adjustments that are being proposed in the NPPF updates and some other aspects that would come through later in the further NPPF that will come later on after the bill becomes an act. And those are basically reiterating, as it is now, that the local housing need is the starting point for considering how to allocate land in your local plan, but also recognising that sometimes there are exceptional circumstances where a local authority may want to sort of consider and proactively make the case to take less growth, I suppose, and less housing numbers because of their special circumstances. And the NPPF prospectus outlines some of those, three of the circumstances. One is where a local authority has actually been doing really well in delivering housing. And at the moment, policy can take into account obviously under provision of housing historically, but not the oversupply, so where local authorities really lent in and delivered well. And sometimes they may have done that in partnership with adjacent local authorities, and they've just chosen to take growth at different stages in the cycle of development and so on. So it sort of brings that back onto a level playing field, which is that if you've you've been doing really, really well on delivery, that it sort of smooths out that delivery expectation in relation to the application of local housing need figures. And then the other things are reflecting circumstances. We all know that every community and every place is unique and has its unique opportunities and constraints. So it's reflecting, local authorities reflecting those constraints and how they absorb the local housing need requirements, particularly in relation to Greenbelt, and also in relation to the existing character and density of the place, and how they then address growth in relation to that existing character and density. So the driver is for local communities to feel that this is their plan, bringing forward the right housing in the right places to the right quality, and that it's basically incentivising those homes to come forward. I'm sure we'll come on to it, Chris, but there's other aspects that are actually about incentivizing why it's good to get a plan in place, and how local authorities will be measured on permissions as well. So we can come on to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody can relate to your point about getting plans adopted, and there's a massive problem there. But let me just ask this, in that context, and given quite a few authorities have already withdrawn their plans, how does the department think this move to voluntary targets will help deliver 300,000 homes a year?
The government remains committed to the 300,000 homes per annum. The objective is to have more plans in place because local authorities feel in charge of the process. And the other balancing act in the conversation is basically if a local authority, as outlined in the bill, has got an up-to-date plan in place, they will no longer be subject to the 5-year housing land supply and fall into a presumption. So in a sense, a sort of emphasis on planning by appeal, to some extent the control moves slightly away from them and towards the developer and the promoter. So it's basically putting more authority back with the local authority and with the emphasis that if you have a local plan in place, those sorts of the risk of having more decided at appeal and out of the hands of the local authority diminishes.
Okay, and it's good to hear the government is still committed to 300,000 a year. But can I just ask what research has been done to establish what the consequences of this move to voluntary targets will be? So, what research has been done?
There's, as you can imagine, in government, we're constantly tracking markets and what's going on across the country. We will continue to track the impact of policy. Actually, I mean, the obvious statement of fact is that it's not actually policy yet. It won't be policy until the MPPF is actually issued formally sometime in the spring, this set of updates. And we'll continue to track what that's meaning for both plan preparation, but then obviously the applications as they come through, and obviously things that go to PINs and so on and so forth. And I would just like to thank the industry also, because there's huge amounts of analysis that I know the industry is doing and feeding back to us on what they're both perceiving, watching out for, and also analysing as well. So that's all really good input into our policy development.
I mean, you would encourage people to respond, wouldn't you? If the industry is concerned about this, then they need to respond, and with evidence and research that shows that what their concerns are, presumably.
Yeah, completely. This is a consultation. There are no fait accomplis. We are consulting with the industry and the public through the MPPF prospectus, and please do give it good consideration. Really importantly, there's sort of two tiers of information in the prospectus. One is obviously captured in the track changes in the MPPF document itself. So those are the sort of near-term proposals for change in the MPPF that would sort of take effect probably, in the spring. I know that's quite a wide concept, the spring. But then actually there's some really important questions in there about further changes in the MPPF and other matters. And so please do consider those as well. And I know there's a lot of consultation documents that we've put out, and we will continue to put out in the coming months, and we can come on and talk about those. But it is really important that we hear from everyone in the industry about how they think this is going to land on the ground, and where they sort of see nuances and consequences that they think we should be aware of.
Okay, well, I know Charlie's got a question coming up later about the timescales for this, because obviously everybody's very interested in the precise timescales. My last question on the MPPF before we turn to the Levelling Up Bill, and that is to ask, how does not needing to do a Greenbelt review assist in boosting the supply of housing?
So just for clarity, and I know sometimes when we put documents out, the nuance of the policy, you might see a headline and not have had time to read the actual wording. What it's basically saying is there's no obligation to review Greenbelt to meet your local housing need. It is not saying you should not. It's actually saying it's up to the local authorities to make that decision. So and therefore, if local authorities see that Greenbelt release is the appropriate way for them to meet their growth, in coordination with their neighbours, for example, then that is absolutely up for grabs for them to do so. So it's not a don't release Greenbelt, it's a make a localised decision as to whether that's the right way to meet growth in your area.
And I suppose one way in which the industry could, help with the consultation is to explain what they think will happen and what they anticipate will happen, rather than necessarily just saying it's an option, because people know what the politicians may choose to do. But anyway, let's move on to the Levelling Up Bill. And I want to start with a sort of very general question, which is, what exactly is levelling up, and what specific acts of the bill will deliver levelling up?
Thanks. So it feels like a bit of a time ago now, but the Levelling Up white paper actually specified 12 missions, levelling up missions. And what is really powerful and fascinating, I mean, as a professional who's worked in sort of across economic development and lots of different, looking at very different outcomes of how we change our urban and our peri-urban environments, we're always sort of talking about what creates, change and regeneration and development, and in essence those things which in old parlance is levelling up, we used to call regeneration. And it is the combination of skills, transport, recognising health disparities, recognising education attainment and access to good education. And the 12 missions actually are that very full suite of considerations. And so levelling up, while this department leads it, and obviously the Secretary of State is the primary person around the cabinet table, it's very much a government programme. And we, Michael Gove sits at the centre of that set of objectives. And so what the bill then does specifically is basically say that government will basically hold itself to account on the delivery of those missions. The missions themselves are not on the face of the bill, but what is a commitment to annually report on a series of levelling up missions and to sort of hold itself to account. So what is, I think, really powerful is that holistic, complex set of issues, if you just take health outcomes, for example, and we all know sort of health disparities when you go, we all know sort of examples of when you look at different health disparities, even within a close geography, in different bits for our cities, for example, or even different bits for our urban to rural areas. It's recognising those sort of complex interwoven sets of issues, and that it takes a cross-government set of programmes to deliver against them. So that's one, that's the sort of, I suppose, the sort of scene setter and the sort of setting of not just objectives and missions, but actions to deliver against them, and the government holding itself to account. And then there are some more, because obviously there are certain things that have to happen in legislation and certain things happen outside legislation. But the particular things that I think are relevant probably to us in the front end of the bill are aspects to support some of the devolution deals that are currently happening. Colleagues will be aware that there was a really important conference yesterday, which Michael Gove spoke at, which was talking about devolution deals and levelling up. And, as colleagues will have seen announced in the press over the last months, there's very proactive work going on about, devolving more responsibilities and funds to deal with those complex issues at the geography of combined authorities. And obviously there's been quite a lot of experimentation and really great work done on that in Greater Manchester over the years. London's the most devolved, as we all know. And what the bill also does is create the ability for county combined authorities to be created as well. So there'll be much more freedom to have, and more combined authorities coming to the fore, which can then take the benefit of these devolution deals and those sort of locally defined programmes and activities and funding.
Yeah, I mean, I know Mary's got a question about those principles of levelling up, but just on that point where you say about more county structures and so on, I mean, it speaks to most professional planners, speak to any of us, we would all say what's missing in the system is far more strategic planning. Guests like Joanna Riddle have talked about it, and, even, dare I say it, regional planning. Just the LUHC, really, does the bill seek to allow a framework, at least, to provide more opportunities for strategic planning?
So the bill is very clear. It talks about the fact that spatial development strategies are with us and they're here to stay, and that's something that local authorities can decide to prepare voluntarily. So that is still very much in the system as it has been, and combine that with the intention, which is in the bill, which is to drop the duty to cooperate, which is seen as a sort of bit of a stumbling block for some local plans, and develop an alignment test where local authorities speak to each other and consider sort of need across a wider area. There's less there for obligation. There's an emphasis on collaboration and partnership, but look at that also in relation to mayoral combined authorities, devolution deals, county combined authorities. You can kind of see that there's this opportunity to sort of look at those geographies and problem solve at those different scales.
Okay, final question from me then on this. How will the new infrastructure levy help deliver infrastructure if it's calculated, the levy, at the completion of development?
Yeah, so the proposal is that what will basically happen is local authorities will be free to set their rates for their infrastructure levy. It will then be applied to the end value, the completion value of development. But it doesn't mean to say it all has to be paid at the back end. And also local authorities will have the freedom to borrow against it. So over time, they'll be able to develop a pot which they can borrow against. And so it does give them more freedom to have a kind of an income stream that they can then borrow against. And also, I mean, colleagues may remember this from previous presentations and discussions, but there is also the thing about the levy. It sets a threshold which you have to meet in terms of funding. But what it also does is where there's a complex or very major scheme, which invariably you cannot dislocate some of the kind of key aspects of infrastructure. And apologies if you've heard me talk about this example before. The really easy go-to is the primary school at the bottom of the housing development in King's Cross. You could never dislocate the delivery of that primary school and the funding of it from the residential above. So there will always be some instances where you can't dislocate the very thing and fund it separately and deliver it separately, either in construction terms or development terms or even in funding terms. So Section 106 will be retained for those kinds of schemes. And again, the levy will set the floor, which a developer will have to meet through in-kind contributions. And of course, potentially go further. But the levy, again, sets that sort of floor to meet as a kind of charge. We will be putting out, in due course, obviously a consultation doc on the infrastructure levy and this sort of broader set of proposals. And I think importantly for colleagues to know is because it's complex, it's quite a big change, although obviously people have been getting very used to and applying SIL very effectively, which is obviously a levy-based system. But the commitment is to do something we refer to as test and learn exercise. So it's not a sort of moment in time you switch to the infrastructure levy. We're going to do piloting, strict testing for a period of time, learn from that, do the feedback loops, and then any adaptation or evolution of the model, we would do that before we roll it out.
Okay, all right. There are lots of issues there that many of us would like to discuss, but we need to move on and to be fair to the other panelists. So, Charlie, do you have a question?
Thanks, Chris. Two questions. One super quick one. When's the final version going to be published?
Spring.
That's a wonderful civil service answer. The second question, I tried to synthesize the audience comments, and the concern that many hold is that the consultation draft, the new framework, provides greater flex for authorities to adopt a requirement that's significantly less than the identified need. And thereafter, the first 5 years, they don't have to have a deliverable 5-year supply even against that reduced figure. So the concern that some people have is that effectively local authorities could, even if they under-deliver against a requirement which itself under-delivers, there's no planning consequence to that. Is that right? And if not, what reassurance can you offer viewers about that? I think that fairly summarises about 6 or 7 comments on the chat.
Yeah, so there are various things we're doing, which is also related to the buffer. So the buffer is the buffers are being dropped against the housing delivery test. There are some really important questions in the consultation doc, which colleagues might want to come back on, very particularly about what we apply to the housing delivery test in this immediate phase. And perhaps, colleagues on the call who've asking questions about that, they're quite important questions that people might want to come back on. They're expressed very openly, because that's sort of the relationship between housing delivery, the housing delivery test, switching off the buffer, and obviously the intention is that the changes to 5-year housing land supply would also kick in at the point that this new version of the NPPF comes out in the spring. So yes, that's a lot of change all at once. So people might want to sort of respond to the questions about housing delivery test and its application.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Paul, do you have a question?
I do, and it's a quick one. You'll be pleased to hear, Joanna, largely because I couldn't be more uncomfortable if I possibly tried sitting sideways in my Audi boxing on the side of the road. So my question is, should local planning authorities who are promoting draft plans at the moment involving Greenbelt release continue to do so, or would they be well advised just to wait to see what the final changes to NPPF will be? And that's obviously in the light of a number of authorities deciding to use the draft NPPF as a reason to postpone or delay or all their plans?
You won't be surprised to hear that I would say, and I think a minister would probably say the same thing, which is keep going with your plan. It is always better to have a plan in place than not having a strategy for your place when it's such an important set of issues that we're trying to grapple with. Seems, to be honest, not the right way to proceed. And if you think about it, it's giving, the local authority has to make proactive choices about, green belts and so on and so forth. So that those conversations can start now. But if they are comfortable with what they're doing, they should absolutely proceed and keep going with their local plan. The other reason to note in terms of timing is in relation to the overarching changes that the bill, the Levelling Up Regeneration Bill, will bring about, and the role and the transition to the new system is worth a quick mention, Paul, if that's all right, because it's relevant to timing issues generally for plans that are in play at the moment. So there's sort of two time frames, one for existing plans that are going through Reg 1918 with the inspector and then beyond. So I'll just quickly talk through both of those because it's worth colleagues know. And this also is outlined in the NPPF prospectus, but I'll just give you the sort of headlines because it's quite important. So if you've got an existing plan that's in preparation, you'll have until June 2025 to submit it, which might seem like quite a long time, but actually for some, there are plans that are sort of in preparation at the minute, and they might be up to the line. And then, obviously through examination and so on, those plans will be expected to be adopted by December 26. I know these seem like long time frames, but in fact, they're pretty, people will need to get motoring. So the submission deadline, just to repeat to PINS, is the 6th, is June 2025. The next time frame is probably more important, actually. If you're at November 2024 and your plan is more than 5 years old, and you're not already in the system and meeting those timelines I've just mentioned, you'll be considered as part of the new system. So, we'll obviously, we'll start to sort of, batch up and obviously discuss which plans come through in what order through the new system. And then you've got 30 months for the new plan, new style local plan and new, faster, more rapid process. That, I think that does create a bit of an incentive to crack on, I'd hope.
But sorry, just as a follow-up to that though, what's the answer to the point that's been raised by a number of authorities about saying, well, we don't want to carry on with our current plan, which releases Greenbelt, because we'll be hauled over the coals if NPPF changes and then allows us to have far more of a choice with regard to Greenbelt release, which seems to be the motivation for why a number of them are pausing. So what's the answers to that when ministers will be saying, I've no doubt, carry on with your plan making?
So they're not going to be hauled over the coals by PINS if they're releasing Greenbelt, because it's their choice.
By voters.
By voters, that's what they need to. They're not going to have long to wait for the NPPF to be out and policy, I suppose, is the short answer. So to be honest, I would kind of keep going and keep that evidence, building up your evidence base and having the conversations.
Thank you.
We're not waiting 6 months for these NPPF changes to come in. It's soon. It's pretty quick.
Spring is coming.
Sasha, your question?
Thank you, Chris. Joanna, Chris has alluded to this. We've obviously got the consultation exercise. Can you reassure those that sit on the development side of the fence that the government is conscious that they have a weighty and important voice in these proposed changes? You'll be aware of the concern that these changes are effectively going to lead to absolutely no stick whatsoever. Can I just ask your views on that, please?
The government is absolutely committed to the 300,000 and housing delivery, and there is a strong emphasis on that. So yes, I can absolutely reassure colleagues about that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and then finally, Mary, your question, please.
Forgive me, Joanna, but I'm going to. We're on a theme here, I feel, and I just want to ask you this, and this comes from Jeff. In part, I completely understand what you're saying about incentivizing. You want to incentivize councils to have local plans, more housing delivery in those areas with up-to-date local plans. But clearly also part of the message is you don't necessarily have to meet all your needs. So there's a question here about what happens to the inevitable gap between the housing that you are able to achieve and your 300,000 home target. There seems to be an inevitable shortfall that we will be looking at as we go forward. And how is the government going to meet that inevitable shortfall if councils don't have to meet their objectively assessed housing needs in full? What's the answer to that?
There's a word that I haven't used up until now, which I probably should have, which is it is about exceptional. So it is about exceptional circumstances. It's not sort of, this is, the onus will be on local government to explain and be clear why they shouldn't meet their local housing need. But what the MPPF update gives them is some matters that they can consider in looking at that. Barring appealing to local councillors to do what they're best for their communities and do that through a plan-led process. I do think that's important. But PINs will be, and as I said in the MPPF in the prospectus, will be asked to be pragmatic, because we've moved into a sort of process where that there's probably not a proportionate approach to the evidence required for some of this work. So there's the document talks about sort of the PINs being pragmatic and considering it being proportionate. So we are in a, Mary, I suppose I'm not very thoroughly answering the question. My point being is we're sort of moving to a point where it is about proportionality in terms of evidence and consideration of the issues based on local circumstance.
I understand you want quicker local plans. You don't want so much resource and time spent in the local in the examination of local plans. I understand that. But on the one hand, the message seems to be, if you can demonstrate the exceptional circumstances, you don't have to meet your housing need. Oh, and by the way, you don't need to cooperate with your neighbours, so you don't need to ask them to make up any gap. And by the way, you don't need to justify your plans. So it kind of, some will worry that the gap between the objective of 300 and there'll be an inevitable shortfall. And maybe the answer might be, I don't know, in those areas where councils get together, you might expect to see greater growth. Your combined authorities, for example.
Yeah, and just to clarify a point, it doesn't say you don't have to justify your plan. It says that one doesn't have to justify the plan or the decisions that have led to the local housing need. It will still be a high bar in terms of evidencing why you should defer from a local housing need and the reasons for doing so. If that's any reassurance.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
So the sort of the emphasis of you don't have to justify is actually it's not that. It's that there will be a more open, a slightly more pragmatic approach by PINs to sort of proportionate evidence.
Yes,
rather than overstraining the evidence to say, well, it's almost like, well, you guys know all this.
No, but that's it. I think it's important to hear that, because I think when you're doing local plan examinations, the justification is quite an important part, has been anyway to date, of the storyline. And the idea that you don't need to justify lower numbers it doesn't seem to me to be the right way to go. Anyway, thank you.
I think to be clear, you will have to, it will have to be justified what the intention that if it's a kind of, I mean, for goodness sake, nobody take this into inquiry and quote me on this, but it's more an 80-20 than a 99 to 1%. It's more, okay, this is a good plan. It's made best endeavours to accommodate growth. there are some constraints, or for that matter, this is a really pro-growth local authority. They want to release their green belt, and that's the way to meet their growth potential. It's basically it's asked the inspector to work through those issues pragmatically with the local authority and set a good plan in place rather than not.
Can a pragmatic examination still be a rigorous examination? Because lots of people, when they hear talk of PINs being pragmatic in various contexts, they think in reality that means a lack of rigour.
That's a quite interesting philosophical question. To my mind, yes, because everything we do in planning is about balancing different issues and different competing needs, demands, risks, creativity, etc. That's just the nature of what we do, isn't it? What is fascinating and interesting to throw a question back at you guys, which is you're the ones who try and disprove or prove sufficient evidence and sufficient rigour into the system. And to some extent, you're there to challenge rigour and decision making.
If we get the opportunity to, the problem.
Yeah. I think what's interesting is to think about what would a local authority want? What would an inspector want? What would a community want? What would you as barristers want? To sort of say, this is the territory which helps us make those informed decisions about, is this plan doing its best for its community and for its place? And how do we make those decisions the phrase of pragmatic is genuinely used as a word, and we are making the right judgments in a balanced way as we do in many areas of planning.
I'm with you, actually. I'm sorry. I don't like the idea that pragmatism means you don't have rigour. I don't subscribe to that point of view. I declare that now.
It's fascinating, isn't it? The balance between tying ourselves up in knots with versus making professional judgments. I mean, and it's a slightly different sort of nuance, isn't it?
I think, Joanna, we're extremely grateful to you. That there are some seriously challenging questions we've asked you there, and you have been unbelievably brave to come on and answer those questions. And we really are grateful that you have. And I think that really what you're saying in some ways is, you can see the disbelief that the development industry has. I'm sure you're aware of that. A lot of people think the 300,000 will in reality be 150,000. So it'll get slashed in half. There'll be no way of getting to 300,000. But we've got to tell you that, haven't we? We've got to write it in and participate in this consultation with evidence to allow you and your team, when they're talking to ministers, to be able to say, this is what we think the consequences will be. And the duty's on us to articulate that. And not just the development industry, but lots of local authority planners and people there. We need to respond to this consultation like never before. That's right, isn't it?
It is exactly right. Government and ministers take advice from officials. They make important decisions. Those decisions are put out for consultation. The process of feedback is incredibly important. The depth and range of feedback is very important. This is the start of. This is the start of quite a lot of change coming into the system. And actually, I know we're sort of getting short of time, but I just want to recognise with colleagues across the industry that we are very aware of this is a bit of change. Will then be followed by a lot more, and we don't see that as we really recognise the sort of that local authorities and others are sort of wanting to see what that journey looks like, wanting to know that we recognise that change is actually difficult. It's not just time consuming, but it's happening at a time where people are dealing with lots of different challenges. And so we are actively thinking about what that change programme looks like, and not just sort of just dropping things in and hoping for the best. And we'll be saying more about that in the coming weeks and months as well. The other, a quick on timing, there's a couple of other consultations that are due out fairly shortly, one on fees and related issues of performance. Again, really important questions in that document. Also the I'm going to have to remind myself, I always forget at least one of them, environmental outcomes reports, which we haven't talked about before. We could have an entire session on that. It's incredibly exciting. In due course, infrastructure levy and other sort of aspects, including things to do with NSIP. So it will be a busy spell for other consultation documents as well coming forward.
Yeah, but perfect. Well, that sounds like an invitation to get you back to talk about some of these other topics. So I hope we can very much do that. And I hope through the consultation, when the consultation responses are in, you take the opportunity as a department to speak to specific groups as well, and call them in and get them to speak on a one-to-one basis, because the consultation responses allow us to do so much, but we can't get everything across. You've been unbelievably generous with your time and extremely brave, and we're unbelievably grateful. Thank you very much. Charlie?
Thanks, Chris. I emphatically second that, Joanna. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm sure everybody watching this, both now and later, will really appreciate the transparency, your very kind offer of explaining the reforms and the thinking behind them, and what we might expect in due course and when. Somebody just say which year and which spring, but I won't push you on that. Thank you very much indeed. Enjoy your reunion event tonight. So you're always welcome back on the show. I'm sure there'll be lots to talk about as the year progresses. Next time, in 2 weeks today, we have Lord Ed Vaizey, who was a cabinet minister previously, Secretary of State for Culture. He wrote a much discussed letter to the Times about some of the design aspects of the proposed consultation paper. And he's going to talk about that and other matters in 2 weeks' time. So we're looking forward to welcoming Ed Vaizey on the show in 2 weeks start time. In the meantime, thank you again, Joanna.
Pleasure.
See you all in 2 weeks. Cheerio.
Bye, Brad.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you so much.